This Stealing the Mind Bible Conference presentation is by Dave Reagan and is entitled Myths That Malign Israel. For a free catalog of hundreds of awesome Bible studies available on DVD video and audio CD, call Compass at 800-977-2177 or download and watch now at our website, compass.org.
Well, greetings to you once again in the name of Jesus, our blessed hope. And once again, I want to invite you to watch our television program and visit our website at lamblion.com. Okay, a few smiles before we get into the topic this evening. The first one is hard to believe, but this is a sign at a church. What happens in Vegas is forgiven here. One of my favorite category of church signs are the ones with strange church names. I'm going to show you one. And why would anybody name the Hurricane First Church of the Nazarene? But I do like their sign, what they say on their sign. Jesus is more precious than silver or goth. One of my all-time favorite signs is this one. Christians, Merry Christmas. Jews, Happy Hanukkah. Atheists, good luck. Or how about this one? Cremation is your last chance for a smoking hot body. This is one of my newest. Adultery is a sin. You can't have your cake and eateth too. The Bible says we cannot know when Jesus is going to return. There's a church who thinks they do. Are you ready for Jesus' return Sunday at 10:30? And then one of my all-time favorite Bible prophecy church signs, Satan, the fat lady is about to sing. Okay, well, I want to talk to you about myths that malign Israel. Father, I come to you in the name of Jesus and thank you again for all the many blessings you've poured out on this conference this day. And I pray that you will continue to do so as we look into your word concerning what is happening in Israel today. Most of all, we may be drawn deeper into your word and deeper into our relationship with you. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, there are two kinds of myths about Israel today regarding the Jewish people and their land. First are the theological myths that have been conjured up by Christian theologians, and second are the political myths that have been fabricated by the political foes of modern-day Israel. The theological myths are grounded in what is called replacement theology. They consist of such allegations as these. God has washed his hands of the Jewish people because of the rejection and murder of Jesus. God has replaced Israel with the church. God has transferred all promised blessings of Israel to the church, and God has no purpose left for the Jewish people. Those lies are taught by the vast majority of Christian churches on the earth today. They are all taught by the Catholic Church. They're taught by the majority of all Protestant churches. For 2,000 years, the church has taught that the Jews should be mistreated because they murdered Jesus. And that is the reason that Romans 9 through 11 are the three most hated chapters in the Bible by the church, because those three chapters say God still loves the Jewish people, still has a purpose for the Jewish people, and one day is going to bring a great remnant of the Jewish people to salvation. I have not going to go into detail about these this evening because I've written about them in detail, spoken about them all over America. I'm going to give my focus to the political myths that have been perpetrated by the world's political leaders in an effort to turn the whole world against the Jewish people with the goal of ultimately destroying the Jewish state. The media is loaded today with these myths about Israel, and they have proved to be very effective in turning most of the world against the Jewish state. The first point that needs to be firmly established about these myths is they are no accident. They are firmly rooted in Satan's hatred of the Jewish people. I mentioned this morning. I want to mention it again today, this afternoon, and that is he hates the Jewish people with a passion because they are the chosen people of God. It is through them that God gave the world the Scriptures, and it was through them that God gave the world the Messiah. Satan further hates the Jewish people because of promises that God has made to the Jews and to the nation of Israel. He has promised, for example, that a great remnant of the Jews will be saved in the end times at the second coming of Jesus when they repent and accept him as their Messiah. God has promised the Jews will be regathered to their homeland in belief. God has promised the Jews that the nation of Israel will be given all the land promised to them in the Abrahamic covenant. God has promised the Jewish state that they will be the prime nation of the world during the millennial reign of Jesus. God has promised that the blessings of God during the millennial will flow to the nations, through the nation of Israel, to all the world. And God has promised, this is one of the most amazing, that the world will respect the Jewish people so much during the millennial reign of Jesus that when a Jew walks by, 10 Gentiles will grab his robe and say, "We want to walk with you because we know God is with you." Today, people hate Jews, they persecute Jews, they kill Jews, they harass Jews, but during the millennial reign of Jesus, it'll be a whole different world. People will say, "We want to walk with you because we know that God is with you." Satan does not want to see a single one of these promises fulfilled, and thus he is determined to annihilate the Jewish people. That's what the Holocaust was all about when 1/4 of them was killed, and it is a reason that he will seek once again to annihilate them during the tribulation when he will kill 2/3 of them. But Satan is destined to fail because it's God's will to bring a remnant of the Jews to repentance and to salvation, and he is determined to fulfill every promise that he has ever made to the Jewish people. But despite these promises of God, Satan persists in his madness toward the Jewish people because he has deceived himself into believing that he can outwit God. And there is no deception worse than self-deception. And thus Satan is now orchestrating all of the nations of the world to come against the tiny nation of Israel through the perpetration of myths concerning the Jewish people and their nation. Paradoxically, in the process of doing this, Satan is fulfilling Bible prophecy, because Zechariah said 2,000 years ago that in the end times, the whole world, including the United States of America, the whole world will come together against Israel. Now, with this brief background, let's take a look at some of the major political myths about the Jewish people that are in the world today. The first one is this: the Jewish people have no claim to the land of Palestine. Now, the first thing I want to point out to you in response to this myth is that that word Palestine is not a biblical word. You will not find the word Palestine in the Bible except in the back where the maps are, where they will always have a map that says Palestine. But there was no Palestine during the time of Christ. It simply was not there. The land did not become known as Palestine until after 70 AD, when the Romans destroyed it. And in their vengeance against the Jewish people, they decided that not only would they destroy the temple and the city and the land, they would disperse the people around the world, and they would change the name of their land to Palestine, which is the Roman Latin word for Philistine. In other words, they named the land after the enemies of Israel to insult the Jews. And so at that point, after the destruction of Israel, it became known as Palestine. Now, as to whether or not the Jews have any rightful claim on the land, the answer is absolutely yes, with all in capital letters. The God of the Jewish people was the one who created the universe. And Psalm 24 verse 1 says he owns the entire world. He owns the planet Earth. He therefore has the right to give any part of this earth to whomsoever he pleases, and it pleased God to give a large section of the Middle East to the Jewish people. This gift occurred 4,000 years ago when God appeared to Abraham and gave him and his descendants a land grant as pictured right here. This is the original land grant given to the Jewish people, stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to the Euphrates River. This is a grant that has never been fully realized, but it will be during the millennial reign of Jesus Christ. A small portion of this area, outlined there in red, a small portion of this is what is currently referred to as Palestine. At the time that Abraham was promised the land, it was referred to as the Canaan land. This large grant outlined here was incorporated into the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12, where God said to Abraham, "Go forth from your country to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great. To your descendants I will give this land." The promise was reconfirmed to Abraham 6 more times. In Genesis 17:7, God declared the promise of this land to be an everlasting covenant. Everlasting covenant. It's a covenant still in effect today. The promise was reconfirmed to Isaac and then to Jacob. And it was reconfirmed through King David in Psalm 105, where King David wrote these words, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he has remembered his covenant forever, the covenant which he made to Abraham and his oath to Isaac. Then he confirmed it to Jacob and to Israel as an everlasting covenant, saying, 'To you I will give this land of Canaan as the portion of your inheritance.'" The fact that the Jews were dispersed from the land for 1,878 years, 1,878, from 70 AD to 1948, does not in any way mean that God invalidated the deed to the land. You see, God had a second covenant with the Jewish people that most people are not aware of. The first covenant was the land title covenant given through Abraham. This was an unconditional covenant. That the second one was a land use covenant that God gave to the Jewish people through Moses. It was conditional. In that covenant, God told the Jewish people that their enjoyment of the land would depend upon their obedience to him and to his word. If they were faithful, there would be blessings. If they were unfaithful, there would be curses. And he made it clear that if they became disobedient and persisted in their disobedience, that the ultimate judgment that would occur would be that the people would be dispersed from the land. And of course, as you know, that ultimately happened. They were dispersed from the land. Let me illustrate this in this way. Let's assume for a moment that you go out and you buy your teenager a very spiffy automobile, and you put that automobile in his name. So he has title to the car. But you say to him, "As long as you live in my house, you're going to live under my rules. And here are the rules for driving your car. And if you disobey these rules, I'm going to punish you." And so, of course, he goes out immediately and shows all of his friends how he can spin the tires and how fast the car can go. And he ends up getting a traffic ticket. And so what do? You take the car, you put it in the garage, and you lock it up for a week. And then you let him have it back. The car still belongs to him, but he can't enjoy it. He can't use it because he was disobedient for a week. So that is what we have in mind here. The crucial point is this. The Jews were dispersed from their land in discipline, but they were not dispossessed of their land. The title to the land is still in their name, and it will belong to them forever. Now, the world, of course, could care less about the Jews' biblical and eternal title of the land. So let's take a look for a moment from a political and legal standpoint. The fact that they have a legal right to the land can be easily established. In November of 1947, the United Nations officially and legally authorized the creation of the modern state of Israel. Prior to that time, Israel had been a League of Nations mandate under the control of the British. But the British decided to give up the mandate, and the United Nations decided to authorize the Jews to take over the land and establish their state. So in 1947, when the British moved out, the United Nations approved a division of the land. And this is the division they decided on. They decided that the light tan areas, those 3 light tan areas, would become the modern state of Israel, and the 3 dark gray areas would become the Arab state, and Jerusalem would be internationalized. Now, the Jews reluctantly agreed to this because, after all, they first had been promised all of Palestine, and then Winston Churchill gave 2/3 of that away and created the state of Jordan. There already is a Palestinian state. And then they had this little sliver of land left, and yet the United Nations divided it up between them and the Arabs. Nonetheless, the Jews reluctantly accepted, and the Arabs refused to accept this. No one can truthfully claim that the Jews do not have a right to this land. It belongs to them both biblically and legally. Biblically by a gift from God, and legally by a determination of the United Nations. Now, the second myth that I want to consider is this one. The Palestinians were forcibly and unjustly evicted from their state by the Jewish people. I hear this over and over and over. It's one of the sacred themes of the Palestinians. Again, the Palestinians were forcibly and unjustly evicted from their state by the Jewish people. Well, the first thing that needs to be considered here is that there never was such a thing as a Palestinian state. Palestine was simply a geographical name that was given to a section of the Middle East that was always under the control of some foreign nation. There has never in history, until recently, been a Palestinian state. Between 1517 and 1917, a period of 400 years, it was part of the Ottoman Empire, whose capital was Istanbul. There was no independent Palestinian state. Never was. Never was a Palestinian indigenous population with its own language and its own culture. By the beginning of the 20th century, Palestine was a desolate, barren land that was sparsely populated. Most of it was owned by absentee Syrian landlords. The people who lived there would have identified themselves as Syrians. They did not call themselves Palestinians. And in fact, the Arabs who lived there did not even begin to call themselves Palestinians until the 1960s. If you ever read Mark Twain's book about the Holy Land, which he wrote in 1866, it was published in 1867, that book describes the Holy Land in detail, what it looked like. It was a barren wasteland. We have photographs from that time also. There was not a single tree left in Israel below the Sea of Galilee. All the trees had been cut down. All of the great agricultural areas of Israel had become malaria-infested swamplands. The Bible prophesied that when the Jews were evicted from the land would become desolate, and that happened. But the Bible also prophesied that when the Jews came back, the land would be transformed into the Garden of Eden. And that is exactly what has happened. Now, the major point that should be made here is that when the Jews began returning to their homeland in the 1890s and early 1900s, they purchased the land from the Arabs. The Arabs claimed, first of all, that they were evicted from their state, which they never had a state. Secondly, they claimed that the Jews came in and confiscated their land by force. That is not true. The Jews bought the land that God had already given them, that the United Nations had already provided. They came back and they bought that land, and they bought it for exorbitant prices. The Arabs didn't want the land. It was a barren, desolate land. They charged the Jews 4 times what it was worth and laughed all the way to the bank because these crazy Jews were coming back and buying this land. So, the Bible again prophesied that the land would become desolate, and when it was evicted, and you can see this in these pictures here. This is one in the valley of Jezreel. Here is a picture of them draining the malaria-infested swamps, the Jews doing this. Nobody wanted this land, and again, they paid 4 times as much for it as they should have. Here is the chapter in Deuteronomy 29. Now the generation to come, your sons, who rise up after you, and the foreigner who comes from a distant land, when they see the plagues of the land, the diseases with which the Lord has afflicted it, they will say, all the land is brimstone and salt, a burning waste, unsown and unproductive, and no grass grows in it like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah. Let me tell you something. God had a purpose in that. He had a purpose in making that a desolate land when the Jews left, because by making a desolate land, nobody in the world wanted it. And he could preserve it for the time when the Jews would come back and they could reconvert it into something like the Garden of Eden. Ezekiel chapter, in fact, this is in the 20th century alone. In the 20th century, the Jews planted 250 million trees in Israel. The forests have been replanted. The land is once again a land of milk and honey. Look at this particular verse about what would happen when the Jews return. The desolate land will be cultivated. This is in Ezekiel 36. Instead of being a desolation in the sight of everyone who passes by, they will say this desolate land has become like the Garden of Eden, and the waste, desolate, and ruined cities are fortified and inhabited. And if you have been to Israel, and I know many of you have seen with your own eyes the fulfillment of that prophecy. That is exactly what happened when the Jews came back. This is what Israel looks like today. A kibbutz up on the Galilee, and all of Israel looks like that. Israel has been totally transformed by the Jewish people. And the latest lie of the Palestinians is It always looked like that, and it looked like that when they stole it from us. They never ceased to come up with lies. The third major myth is that Israel has kept the Palestinian refugees of 1948 and 49. They have kept them in miserable refugee camps for over 70 years by refusing to allow them to return. Well, this is simply a myth. It is true that during the War of Independence in 48 and 49, that many Arabs left the land of Israel. But they left the land of Israel not because the Jews evicted them. They left because the attacking armies told them, we are going to attack the land, we're going to kill everybody in the land, get out of the land, and we'll make the Mediterranean run red in the blood of the Jews. And so they left at the urging of the Arab leaders, not because Israel kicked them out of the land. They fled at the request of 5 different armies that came into Israel after its declaration of independence. Israel declared its independence on May the 14th, 1948. The next day, 5 Arab nations attacked. They attacked from all directions. And again, they had told these people to flee. And they did flee. Approximately 650,000 fled the land, and after the war ended, the Arab nation refused to absorb these people. So 650,000 flee the land. They flee over into Arab lands, but the Arabs refuse to bring them into their lands and make them citizens and give them jobs and absorb them in any way. Instead, the Arabs simply herded these people into miserable refugee camps that are located along the border of Israel. They're not actually in Israel. They're over in Jordan and the surrounding countries, Lebanon and others. And they put them there because they wanted to use them as pawns of public opinion, to turn public opinion against Israel and tell the world, look how the Israelis are treating these poor people who fled from their land. Today, there are only 30,000 of these refugees left alive. But the Palestinians argue over and over there are 5 million refugees because they count their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. Now, in contrast, let me tell you something that the world doesn't know and that no one talks about. And that is that in that same war, 1948 and 49, all the Jews in the Middle East, all of them were forcibly evicted from the Arab countries. Forcibly. Over 800,000 Jews were forcibly evicted. I had a friend who owned a travel agency in Jerusalem, and he was an Egyptian Jew, and he came from a very wealthy family. And he said, David, the day that war ended, the Egyptian government gave us 48 hours to get out of Egypt. He said, we had a mansion, we had huge businesses, we had automobiles, we had bank accounts, and we were given 48 hours. And in 48 hours, we had to flee to Israel, and we left behind our home, our cars, our bank accounts, our businesses. Everything was confiscated, and this was done all over the Arab Middle East. That is what happened when the Jews were forcibly evicted. Here is a brief summary of the Palestinian myth that is given by a man by the name of Domitian Washington, who is Director of Diversity Outreach for Christians United for Israel. Let's hope this works.
Visit Israel, and you'll be startled by how many colors you'll see. I don't mean the colors of the buildings or landscape. I mean the colors of the people. Black, white, olive, brown, and everything in between. Israel is a true united nation. That's because Israel is a nation of refugees from everywhere. And more than half of them are from, are you ready? Arab countries. Over 850,000 Jews were expelled or fled from the Middle East and North Africa following the Arab country's attack on Israel when it gained its independence in 1948. For over 2,000 years, these Jews had lived in the Arab countries of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, and in the Muslim but non-Arab countries such as Turkey and Iran. Today, they form over half of Israel's Jewish population. Many of these Jews from Middle Eastern lands look, well, just like other people from Middle Eastern lands, of darker complexion with dark hair. Other Jews migrated from North Africa. So why is their story so unfamiliar to most people? The most important reason is that they didn't remain refugees for long. But refugees they most certainly were. The vast majority forced to leave their homes, possessions, and businesses behind. In other words, they came to Israel with nothing. Some 650,000 of the Jews forced to flee North Africa and the Middle East became citizens of Israel. The other 200,000 fled to the United States and other Western countries. To give you an idea of how few Jews remain in Arab countries, consider these numbers. There were 150,000 Jews in Iraq in 1948. Today, there are less than 10. There were 140,000 Jews in Algeria. Today, there are less than 50. There were 75,000 Jews in Egypt. Today, less than 20. The pattern is the same across North Africa and the Middle East. Now contrast these forgotten Jewish refugees with the most celebrated refugees in the world, the Palestinians. How is it that the Jewish refugees are not even an afterthought, but the Palestinians are the longest lasting, most lavishly supported refugee population in the history of the world? The answer is purely political. After Israel gained its independence in May of 1948, the surrounding Arab nations attacked the new Jewish state. As a result, about 700,000 Arabs living in Israel fled. Many left because of the war, and many did because they were told by Arab leaders to leave the Jewish areas. The idea was that they would return once the Jews and their state had been destroyed. Khalid al-Azam, the Syrian prime minister in 1948 to 1949, admitted this Arab role in persuading Palestinians to leave. In his memoirs, he wrote, "Since 1948, we have been demanding the return of the refugees to their homes, but we ourselves are the ones who encouraged them to leave." That's how the Arab, later renamed Palestinian refugee crisis, was created. In 1949, the United Nations formed UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for the Palestinian refugees, the largest and only long-term UN agency that was ever formed to deal with just one group of refugees. 70 years later, it still exists and still calls the Palestinians and their children and their grandchildren refugees. It has an annual budget of over $1 billion, funded mostly by the US and the European Union. How much did the Jewish refugees who were expelled from the Middle East and North Africa receive from the UN? How much did Israel receive to help toward their resettlement? How much does it receive today? The answer to all three questions is the same: zero. So the next time you hear someone talk about the Palestinian refugees, ask them why they never talk about the Jewish refugees. And the next time you hear people talk about Israel being settled by Europeans, ask them if they've ever seen an actual picture of Israelis in color.
Tremendous presentation. Well, we can rejoice over the fact that President Trump in August of last year announced that the United States would no longer recognize refugees of Palestine who fled Israel in 1948-49. He also announced that the UN Relief Agency, which exists solely for the purpose of sustaining these people for political pawns, that they would no longer receive the annual $300 million from the United States. That was a great day. Hopefully this action will force the Arab nations to absorb these populations as they should have done a long time ago. The fourth major myth that I'd like to consider is the claim that the Palestinians are the true indigenous people of the land, like the American Indians, and that the Jews are colonialist invaders from Europe. This is one of the fundamental contentions of the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that so many American corporations and churches have bought into, like the Presbyterian Church, for example. For a long time, the Palestinians argued that they were the descendants of the Philistines, but when it was brought to their attention that the Philistines originated in the Greek Aegean Islands and came to Israel about 1300 BC when the Greeks expelled them, well, the indigenous people argument was changed. And now today they claim that they are the descendants of the Canaanites. Well, Mahmoud Abbas, who is the leader of the Palestinians, has heavily emphasized this nonsense in recent years. But you might keep in mind that he's also the one who has made these claims. He claims that Jesus was a Palestinian. He claims that the people Moses led out of Egypt were Muslims. He claims that there was never a Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And additionally, he is also a Holocaust denier who wrote his doctrinal dissertation saying that the Holocaust was a complete fiction created by the Jewish people to generate worldwide sympathy for them. So this man lives in a world of lies. The idea that the Jews in Israel today are colonial occupiers is completely absurd. There has been an uninterrupted Jewish presence in that land for 4,000 years. These are church members, Christians, protesting against Israel. And notice, colonialism, apartheid, dispossession. They mean well. They bought a lie. And because they bought that lie, they have turned against Israel. Even during the dispersion of the Jews worldwide after 70 AD, there continued to be Jewish people living in Jerusalem and in the Galilee. And the Jews who have returned to their homeland have not just returned from Europe. They're not white colonialists. They have come from over 100 countries scattered all over the world. There is just no way to say that they are some sort of European colonial force. Nor can the Palestinians be considered descendants of the Canaanites. There is no genealogical or genetic evidence whatsoever that connects the Arabs of the Middle East to the extinct Canaanites. In reality, the Palestinians in the Middle East are Arabs who migrated to the Israeli area from places like Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Egypt. Yasser Arafat, for example, was born and raised in Egypt. And notice this revealing quote of his, very egotistical quote. He said, "The Palestinians, the people, have no identity, but I, Yasser Arafat, man of destiny, will give them that identity through conflict with Israel." And in 2012, the Hamas Minister of the Interior and Security, Fatah Hamad, stated, "Half the Palestinians are Egyptians and the other half are Saudis." Number 5, Jerusalem is the historic capital of the Palestinian people and is the third most holy site in all of Islam. This is what President Trump would call fake news. This is what I would call baloney. The truth is that Jerusalem has never been the capital of any nation except the nation of Israel, period. When David conquered the city, the small village 3,000 years ago, it was a tiny rural Jebusite village. It was made the capital of Israel and served in that capacity for more than 1,000 years. It's never been the capital of any other nation, none. The Roman capital during the time of Jesus, the Roman capital was Caesarea Maritime on the coast. The Crusader capital was Akko. The capital of Palestine during the 400 years of Ottoman rule was Istanbul. The mythical claim that Jerusalem is the third most holy site in Islam after Medina and Mecca is a manufactured political ploy to make an unjustifiable claim on the city. Jews pray toward Jerusalem. Muslims, if you could see this picture up close, pray toward Mecca. They don't pray for Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem is mentioned in the Hebrew Scriptures more than 700 times. In the Quran, there is not one mention of the city of Jerusalem. The Muslims' claim to Jerusalem, their spiritual claim, is based upon a myth, on the legend that Muhammad rode his flying horse to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, where he was taken up into heaven for a visit. That is their claim on the city of Jerusalem. They base that claim on a statement in the Quran that says that Muhammad rode his horse to the farthest mosque. Well, that mosque was located in Saudi Arabia and went by that name, the farthest mosque. The passage in the Quran could not be referring to the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount today, because it did not even exist during Muhammad's lifetime. Muhammad died in 632 AD. The Al-Aqsa Mosque was completed in 706 AD, 73 years after his death. So there was no way he could visit that mosque during his lifetime. But who cares about that from the Palestinian viewpoint? Number 6, for 70 years, Israel has been preventing the right of the Palestinian people to create a state for themselves. This is one of their major claims. 70 years, those evil Jews have kept us from establishing a state for ourselves. Well, the first thing to consider here is the absolutely irrefutable fact that the Palestinians already have a state. That state is called Jordan. In December of 1917, the British issued the Balfour Declaration promising Palestine as a homeland for the Jewish people. That is what Palestine looked like in 1917. All of that was promised to the Jewish people. But as I mentioned before, in 1921, Winston Churchill, acting as British colonial secretary, issued a declaration which gave 2/3 of Palestine to the Arab peoples, and the state of Transjordan was completed. The reason he did this is because the Arabs began to discover oil in the Middle East, and he wanted to curry the favor of the Arabs. This left the Jews only a very small sliver of land. Israel is tiny. Most people don't understand how small this land is. It's only 260 miles long. It is only 70 miles wide and only 9 miles wide at its narrowest point. The Jews felt betrayed when the British did this, but they swallowed hard, and they began looking for the day when they would have their nation in that little sliver of land. But then, as I pointed out, in November of 1947, the UN voted to divide that little sliver into 2 states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs, thus creating a second Palestinian state, as I showed you a few moments ago. And on May the 14th, 1948, the greatest event of the 20th century occurred from a biblical viewpoint, from a spiritual viewpoint. The greatest event, the reestablishment of the nation of Israel. In Tel Aviv, as David Ben-Gurion stood up and read the Declaration of Independence. Now, I come to one of the most important points in this entire presentation. Listen carefully. Here is the important point that the press never mentions and certainly is never mentioned by the Palestinians. On the very day that the Jews declared the establishment of the State of Israel, the Palestinians could have met in Ramallah and declared the establishment of a second Palestinian state and done so legally, and the Jews could not have done anything about it because the United Nations voted to create 2 states, the Jewish state and another Arab state, but the Arabs decided they wanted it all. They wanted it all. And so instead of establishing their state, they launched a war against Israel, which they lost. So, they invaded instead of declaring. And the result was that ever since then, they have not had a state. If they had established their state then, which they had every legal right to do, they could have been celebrating their 70th anniversary last year, just as the Jews celebrated the 70th anniversary of their state. Nor was 1948 their only opportunity. They've had several, one of which was in the year 2000 at the Camp David conference that President Clinton convened. At that conference, President Clinton tried to convince, did convince Ehud Barak on the left there, the most liberal prime minister in the history of Israel. He convinced him to agree to give in to 95% of all of the Palestinian demands. When these incredible concessions were made, Yasser Arafat's response was to get up from the table, go to the airport, fly back to Israel, and launch the Intifada, the Arab uprising. He didn't even say a word. He just got up and left the room when the Prime Minister of Israel agreed to 95% of all he wanted. The reason he did that is because he knew he could not compromise with Israel. He knew that he would risk his life if he gave in to any Israeli demands, if he didn't get everything they wanted. And of course, all that they wanted was the nation of Israel. They wanted the entire thing and not just a little bit. Here is the most articulate diplomat in the history of Israel, Abba Eban, and he summed it up best. He said, "The Palestinians have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity." Even some Arab leaders are getting fed up with the Palestinians. For example, the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed Salman, recently said, for the past 40 years, the Palestinian leadership has missed opportunities again and again and have rejected all offers it was given. It's about time that the Palestinians accept the offers and agree to come to the negotiating table, or they should shut up and stop complaining. I want to present to you a summary by Prager University of what I have just covered concerning this, presented by this man, David Borg, the former executive director of Christians United for Israel.
If Israel just allowed the Palestinians to have a state of their own, there would be peace in the Middle East, right? That's what you hear from UN ambassadors, European diplomats, and most college professors. But what if I told you that Israel has already offered the Palestinians a state of their own, and not just once, but on 5 separate occasions? Don't believe me? Let's review the record. After the breakup of the Ottoman Empire following World War I, Britain took control of most of the Middle East, including the area that constitutes modern Israel. 17 years later, in 1936, the Arabs rebelled against the British and against their Jewish neighbors. The British formed a task force, the Peel Commission, to study the cause of the rebellion. The commission concluded that the reason for the violence was that two peoples, Jews and Arabs, wanted to govern the same land. The answer, the Peel Commission concluded, would be to create two independent states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs, a two-state solution. The suggested split was heavily in favor of the Arabs. The British offered them 80% of the disputed territory, the Jews the remaining 20%. Yet, despite the tiny size of their proposed state, the Jews voted to accept this offer, but the Arabs rejected it and resumed their violent rebellion. Rejection number 1. 10 years later, in 1947, the British asked the United Nations to find a new solution to the continuing tensions. Like the Peel Commission, the UN decided that the best way to resolve the conflict was to divide the land. In November 1947, the UN voted to create two states. Again, the Jews accepted the offer, and again, the Arabs rejected it. Only this time, they did so by launching an all-out war. Rejection number 2. Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria joined the conflict, but they failed. Israel won the war and got on with the business of building a new nation. Most of the land set aside by the UN for an Arab state, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, became occupied territory, occupied not by Israel, but by Jordan. 20 years later, in 1967, the Arabs, led this time by Egypt and joined by Syria and Jordan, once again sought to destroy the Jewish state. The 1967 conflict, known as the Six-Day War, ended in a stunning victory for Israel. Jerusalem and the West Bank, as well as the area known as the Gaza Strip, fell into Israel's hands. The government split over what to do with this new territory. Half wanted to return the West Bank to Jordan and Gaza to Egypt in exchange for peace. The other half wanted to give it to the region's Arabs, who had begun referring to themselves as the Palestinians, in the hope that they would ultimately build their own state there. Neither initiative got very far. A few months later, the Arab League met in Sudan and issued its infamous 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. Again, a two-state solution was dismissed by the Arabs, making this rejection number 3. In 2000, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak met at Camp David with Palestinian Liberation Organization Chairman Yasser Arafat to conclude a new two-state plan. Barak offered Arafat a Palestinian state in all of Gaza and 94% of the West Bank, with East Jerusalem as its capital. But the Palestinian leader rejected the offer. In the words of US President Bill Clinton, Arafat was here 14 days and said no to everything. Instead, the Palestinians launched a bloody wave of suicide bombings that killed over 1,000 Israelis and maimed thousands more on buses, in wedding halls, and in pizza parlors. Rejection number 4. In 2008, Israel tried yet again. Prime Minister Ehud Olmert went even further than Ehud Barak had, expanding the peace offer to include additional land to sweeten the deal. Like his predecessor, the new Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas, turned the deal down. Rejection number 5. In between these last 2 Israeli offers, Israel unilaterally left Gaza, giving the Palestinians complete control there. Instead of developing this territory for the good of its citizens, the Palestinians turned Gaza into a terrorist base from which they have fired thousands of rockets into Israel. Each time Israel has agreed to a Palestinian state, the Palestinians have rejected the offer, often violently. So if you're interested in peace in the Middle East, maybe the answer is not to pressure Israel to make yet another offer of a state to the Palestinians. Maybe the answer is to pressure the Palestinians to finally accept the existence of a Jewish state.
Before I proceed, let me just say I'm going to do something right now that I've never done before in all the years I've spoken at these conferences. Never once have I ever run over time. But I'm going to have to go a little bit over time to get this finished. I hope you won't throw stones at me, but I need to make another point. And I apologize to Bill for this. The seventh and final of the myths that have been created about Israel is the most important one. It's the one that's really turning the world against them. And that is the myth that Israel is an apartheid state. For those of you who may not be familiar with that term, apartheid, let me pause to explain. It's the term used to describe the policy that prevailed in South Africa for many years that required strict separation of the races. This claim against Israel is a classic example of the truth espoused by Hitler's propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels when he said, if you tell a lie big enough and often enough, people will believe it. Folks, the truth is there is absolutely no apartheid in Israel. None whatsoever. In fact, the truth is that the only apartheid that can be found in the Middle East is in the Arab nations where Jews are not even allowed to live. Israel has 1.7 million Arabs living within its borders. They are not separated from Israelis in any way. They enjoy complete citizenship rights, including the right to work, unemployment, medical, welfare benefits, the right to vote, even the right to serve in the Israeli parliament. The only right that they do not have is the right to serve in the military unless they want to. All Israelis are required to, but the Palestinians are not required to. They can if they want to. So that's the only way in which they are treated differently. And here is another of those remarkable videos that tells you the truth about apartheid.
Maybe you've heard someone say that Israel is an apartheid state, that Israel has a policy of segregating and oppressing the minority population within its borders, like South Africa once did. Maybe you've been so outraged by this information that you have considered joining the BDS movement, the effort to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel until it ends its alleged racist policies. I don't blame you. Apartheid is a great evil and deserves to be fought wherever we find it. But here's the thing. You won't find apartheid in the state of Israel. So, I'll put it bluntly. The BDS movement is a slick propaganda effort built on lies. I think I have the credibility to make this claim. Having grown up in South Africa and having spent a fair amount of time in Israel, I know what apartheid is and what it is not. My parents were raised under real apartheid, where blacks were, by law, separated from whites at every level, from education to drinking fountains. Blacks couldn't vote, couldn't own land, couldn't live next to or use the same transportation system as whites. I remember my father telling me about how my grandfather was kicked and humiliated in public by a young white boy. All he was permitted to say was, "Please stop, little boss." That was the world my family lived in. That was the world of apartheid South Africa. But in Israel, the law is colorblind. Israeli Arabs have the same rights as Israeli Jews. They ride the same buses, study in the same schools, and are treated in the same hospitals. Arabs are elected to Israel's parliament, serve as judges, and fight in the Israeli military. On my first trip to Israel, the group I was with had a Jewish tour guide and an Arab bus driver. Imagine our surprise having heard that Israel is an apartheid state. This would have been inconceivable in apartheid South Africa. All these things would be self-evident to anyone who did any kind of actual research, or even better, visited Israel, something I encourage everyone to do. BDS doesn't want you to research or visit Israel. It depends on the ignorance of its audience. Sadly, on American college campuses, BDS has a significant presence. It succeeds by playing on the good intentions of good people through deliberate deception. In short, they lie. And lies really make me angry because lies empower evil. Lies about blacks empowered apartheid in South Africa. Lies about Jews made the Holocaust possible. And lies about Israel are misleading a lot of good-hearted young people into opposing the only country in the entire Middle East that doesn't segregate and oppress its minority population. Just ask the next Egyptian Copt or Iraqi Christian you meet on campus. So the question people should really be asking is, what does the BDS movement want? The answer is simple. They want to destroy Israel. They can't do it militarily, so they try to do it through lies. They say that Jews have no historic claim to Israel. Lie. They say that Israel treats its Arabs as second-class citizens. Lie. They say that Israel doesn't want peace with its Arab neighbors. Lie. If you tell lies and you tell them often enough, people who don't know the truth start to believe them. The BDS movement's leaders barely tried to hide the charade. They will lie and say that they only want a Palestinian state living side by side with Israel. And then they say this: we oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. Ending the occupation doesn't mean anything if it doesn't mean upending the Jewish state itself. That's from Omar Barghouti, a founder of BDS. Barghouti lives in Israel, so you might expect that he said this from inside an Israeli prison, like Nelson Mandela during South Africa apartheid. You would be wrong. Barghouti is a PhD student at Israel's Tel Aviv University, where he enjoys the same rights as every Israeli. My parents could only dream of that kind of freedom. Is Israel a perfect country? No. There are as many perfect countries as there are perfect people. But to call it an apartheid state is not only an insult to the only democracy in the Middle East and the only country with equal rights for all its minorities, it's also an insult to the actual victims of apartheid, like my parents and all those who suffered under it. I'm Olga Mishra for Prager University.
Well, as you can see, the lie is a lie about apartheid. And I want to show you one more very, very brief video of what happened at the United Nations Human Rights Council recently. This is the council that spends all of its time condemning Israel. It's the council that President Trump said, I finally had enough of you. We're pulling the United States out of this council. And this is a meeting that they had where the governments, now I want you to notice as you watch this, the government's attacking Israel. They're the worst governments on planet Earth, claiming Israel is terrible and they are the worst nations on the planet. And the interesting thing is that at the United Nations, there are what are called NGO groups, non-government organizations. There's 3,000 of them. They're allowed to attend all the meetings. They cannot vote. And at the end of this, a member of an NGO says something that will knock you out of your seat. You'll hear a voice of a translator.
Israel, the occupying power, continues with its colonial policy and its daily violations. It continues to abuse, to arbitrarily detain, to carry out ethnic cleansing, steal land and natural resources, uproot trees, steal money, Israeli activity to Judaize Jerusalem, demolition of homes, confiscation of land and property, spoiling of natural resources.
Racist violations perpetrated by Israel.
Israel continues to commit various forms of human rights violations in Palestine.
Israel, the occupying power, is advancing in its efforts of mass colonization and continued apartheid. Put an end to this colonialist regime.
Apartheid, atrocities and massive destruction inflicted on the Palestinian people.
War crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and state terror.
Thank you. United Nations Watch.
Shukran, Sayyid Rais. I take the floor on behalf of the UN Watch. My name is Mus'ab Hassan Youssef. I grew up in Ramallah as a member of Hamas. I address the words to the Palestinian Authority, which claims to be the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. I ask, where does your legitimacy come from? The Palestinian people did not elect you, and they did not appoint you to represent them. You are self-appointed. Your accountability is not to your own people. This is evidenced by your own total violation for their human rights. In fact, the Palestinian individual and their human development is the least of your concerns. You kidnap Palestinian students from campus and torture them in your jails. You torture your political rivals. The suffering of the Palestinian people is the outcome of your selfish political interest. You are the greatest enemy of the Palestinian people. If Israel did not exist, you would have no one to blame. Take responsibility for the outcome of your own actions. You fan the flames of conflict to maintain your abusive power. Finally, you use this platform to mislead the international community, to mislead the Palestinian society, to believe that Israel is responsible for the problems you create. Thank you.
Well, that surprise speaker was a Palestinian who's the son of the founder of Hamas. And here is his opinion of Islam. Islam is not a religion of peace. Islam is a religion of war, and most Muslims don't understand the true nature of Islam. Well, folks, that brings me to the end of my presentation. I think you can see that these myths are conjured up by Satan to destroy the nation of Israel. They're all lies to the core. And I think perhaps Netanyahu has summed it up best. They often say Israel is the major obstacle to peace in the Middle East, and here's what his response is. His response is, if the Arabs would disarm, there would be peace in the Middle East. If Israel were to disarm, Israel would cease to exist. Well, we can be assured God is on the throne. God is in control. He has the wisdom and power to orchestrate all the evil of mankind to the triumph of His Son in history. He sits on the throne laughing at all of these things that are being done because He is going to overcome them. He is going to send His Son back to reign over in majesty from Mount Zion in Jerusalem. And in that glorious day when He returns, that Jewish remnant's going to repent. They're going to cry out, Baruch haba Hashem Adonai. And in the meantime, you and I need to get up each morning, look at the sky, and shout from the bottom of our hearts, Maranatha, 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 come quickly, Lord Jesus. Thank you, and God bless you.
This has been Myths That Malign Israel, presented by Dave Reagan. To receive a free catalog of hundreds of awesome Bible studies on DVD, video, and audio CD, all using and defending a literal translation of the Bible, information on upcoming Bible conferences in your area, or details of our missionary outreach and trips to Israel, call Compass at 800-977-2177 24 hours a day, or visit us on the web at compass.org. And be sure to like us on Facebook. Search facebook.com/Compass Bible.